I'm happy to introduce you, Carla Marant, who is the project manager of our ANR CulturIA project. Carla, je vais te mettre en co-host.
Bien sûr.
Hi, Carla. Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you finally in the video.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
it's great to be here.
We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. Hi, Rudy. Hi, Johanna. It's nice to see the two of you.
You got a few friends online. I'm happy.
Apparently, I do. I'm pleasantly surprised.
Oh, it's great to see you.
You too.
I didn't, as I wrote you, I didn't know that you changed to Canada.
Oh, yes, that was a pandemic move to get back closer to home. So it's a bit weird being in the School of Communication now, but it's been a really good move for me, I think.
That's not Vancouver, isn't it? Or is it Vancouver?
It is in Vancouver.
Oh, okay.
It's SFU is a bit of it's a commuter campus on the top of a small mountain in a town called Burnaby that is just adjacent to Vancouver. So I live in Vancouver and we all kind of commute up the mountain for work.
I see. I've been in Vancouver once, but I'm not in your university.
Okay.
So looking forward to hear your talk.
Oh, thanks, Rudy. Well, you've probably heard me talk about lots of these things already, but
that's
hopefully
true.
There'll be some new material for you too.
It's always a pleasure.
Is it okay? I'm just going to try to share my screen. Is that all right?
Yes, I think you can do it.
Looks like I can. How's
yes.
that? Can you see that?
Sounds perfect. Yes.
Great. Okay.
Let's wait a few more minutes if you don't mind.
Sure.
Your talk is going to be of great importance in our project because you know we are interested in this very part of the history of computing of AI. This is very beginning in the US, and we don't have many information and story about this time, so it's really important for us to have you online.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad it will be of interest. It's been so interesting watching the field of the history of AI grow so much over the last 10 years, and I'm really grateful that it's so much more interesting. I feel like I'm kind of the boring one now talking about, you know, the 50s in the US. So I'm glad that it's
not at all. We intend to publish a book on the history of AI in 2 years, and we will have many French and English people, and I hope you may join this project. But let's hear you first. Maybe Carla, you can introduce Stephanie, as you had already exchanged a lot with her. Your mic is closed.
Wait, of course. So yeah, we heard of your project first on AI. It's the seminar you're working on, right? So let me check because I have to admit people first. Yeah, we first heard of a history of artificial intelligence, a genealogy of power, and that is why we wanted to connect with you to organize this seminar. So Stephanie Dick is an assistant professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University. She's a historian of mathematics and computing in post-war United States. And her first book project was Making Up Minds, and it explores the efforts to automate mathematical theorem proving, and problem solving in the post-war United States. Then there's your second project, which is a historical study of the New York State identification and intelligence system, and the first centralized law enforcement data bank in the US. So now we are really happy to hear your research, since we've been waiting for that since last year. And I will give you now la parole.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Alexander. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so happy that you found me and that there are so many now sustained and collective histories of AI being undertaken. I just dropped in the chat there a link to the Histories of AI, a Genealogy of Power project that Carla mentioned, which wrapped up last year, but has some collective resources that were generated from that series, in case they're of any use to this community as well. So thank you so much. I'm honored to be a part of this series. I wish my French was a little better, because then I would have attended more of the sessions. And I hope that it's been an interesting set of talks so far. So a foundational observation across a lot of my work has been that every time someone says that a computer has done something, that it has accomplished a given task, that it has recognized a face or diagnosed a disease or won a game of chess, that a computer has proved a mathematical theorem, that it has written a poem, every time we hear these pronouncements about a task that the computer has accomplished, I argue that that task has been redefined every time. It's been transformed into something that a computer can do. It has been put into the terms of the computer. It has been translated into data structures and programming languages and computer operations. It has been remade within the computer's context and with the machine in mind, its affordances and its limitations. That task, whatever it is, has been put into the terms that computer programmers and engineers know and understand and can work with. There isn't any automation without some fundamental part of transformation. Automation is the act of putting things into the terms of the machine and into the terms of the people who control and operate and develop them. And all of the work that I've been doing has been an exploration of what those transformations entail, what those redefinitions, those translations, those acts of accommodation actually involve. And I've been particularly interested, as I assume many in this group have been as well, in what happens when human cognitive faculties like intelligence or reasoning or knowledge have been put into the terms of the machine. How have those faculties been understood in new ways with the machine in mind? And I'm actually on teaching leave this term to finally, at long last, finish my first book manuscript, which is called Making Up Minds, Computing and Proof in the Post-War United States. And it is about attempts to automate mathematical theorem proving, mathematical reasoning, and mathematical knowledge in the second half of the 20th century United States. And it's about what happened to those faculties as they were abstracted and extracted from people and put into the machine. People are constantly being remade in more ways than one alongside our technologies, especially those that are meant to capture and reproduce or reflect back something that is essential about the human. As Lucy Suchman put it in Human Machine Reconfigurations back in 2006, quote, just what it means to be human-like and how the boundary between humans and non-humans is correspondingly drawn and redrawn is, of course, one of the matters in question. AI and robotics involve a kind of doubling or mimicry in the machine that works as a powerful disclosing agent for assumptions about the human. The human, of course, is not stable in the history of technology or in the history of ideas, but humanness has rather been a relative concept. In Western European hands, humanness is a relative idea, and humanness has been defined in opposition to a great many others. Humans in European hands have been defined relative to God and to angels, what they have in common, what they do not have in common. Humanness has been defined relative to animals and, of course, also to various machines. But humanness, I think it's important to note, is also a category that has done great violence as well. Western Europeans and Americans in service of colonial ends also had defined humanness through history in opposition to other people, those that they wished to colonize, to control, to enslave, to exclude, to exterminate. A lot of this violence has been justified by the dehumanization of many people, and often, in fact, by the denial that those people share those higher cognitive faculties like reasoning and rationality and intelligence. But in the 20th century, of course, computers became and remain today one of the core others, according to which humanness is being defined through perceived similarity and difference. A great many stories have been told about computers that feature claims about what is human or inhuman about them, what is machine-like or not machine-like about people. And in fact, in the field of automated mathematics, automated theorem proving, automated proof verification, automated mathematical problem solving, that's the area of focus in the book I'm finishing. Different kinds of human ability, human contribution, and human cognitive labor were used to sound out the limits and the possibilities that different researchers perceived in the modern digital computer. To give you some sense of that, here are some snippets of the almost always anthropomorphic language used to suggest what kinds of contributions computers were thought to be able to make to mathematics in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. Some researchers suggested that, at least in principle, everything human mathematicians do could be automated, and that computers would eventually become like colleagues or mentors or co-workers. Others thought that computers would be more like assistants or students or graduate students, capable of carrying out all kinds of work and problem solving, but not without expert guidance. And others believed that computers would only ever be able to make rote mechanical tasks and to contribute that type of labor, and would be more like servants or slaves. And I want to say a little bit more about that language later. So in this talk today, I wanted to share two stories, and Johanna and Rudy will have probably heard these stories before, but they're two different accounts of the human and the machine, and in particular, two accounts of human reasoning, that cognitive faculty seen as so central to intelligence, knowledge production, law, social order, that emerged in the earliest years of artificial intelligence research in the US. And I want to explore how these two very different visions of the human and of human reasoning informed very different research programs in early computing and AI. So this is, in a sense, a tale of two reasons, as it were. And the first is a familiar story that many of you are likely to be familiar with, at least in broad strokes. I will begin with the theory of the human and of human reasoning and intelligence that informed Alan Newell and Herbert Simon's work when they developed the logic theory machine, their inaugural AI program that produced proofs of logic theorems from Principia Mathematica in the mid-1950s. And the second story is from a far less well-known character, a Chinese-American logician by the name of Hao Wang. And he also developed a set of computer programs in the late 1950s that did essentially the same thing. It proved theorems from Principia Mathematica, but according to a very different vision of the human, of the machine, and of the intellectual history that informed them. And by exploring these two accounts of the human together, we can see how research agendas and automation approaches encode theories of the human and of human-machine relationships in such different ways. I propose that there's a lot to be learned from Wang's critique of Newell and Simon's work, which anticipate a lot of the critiques that humanists are now articulating of AI in general. And I think from Wang's rejection of some of the core assumptions that Newell and Simon made, we can also envision alternative possibilities for computing and AI. So the logic theory machine was developed by Alan Newell and Herbert Simon at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California. Rand, for those who are unfamiliar, was founded at the end of the Second World War and was supported by the US Air Force in particular. And Rand had been given the rather audacious mandate of exploring what future global wars were going to look like and to develop strategies for winning them. How could they know what those future wars would look like? The simple answer was that they couldn't. There were so many uncertainties about what new technologies would be developed, what geopolitical regions and states would be involved, when, where, and how would the wars of the future be fought. None of this could be known. And a lot of research at Rand was about trying to find ways of optimizing America's chances for those future global wars in spite of all of that uncertainty. Lots of researchers at Rand were trying to find ways to model and predict and optimize warfaring practices and systems without knowing any of those details. And actually, the version of AI that Newell and Simon pioneered was born out of that same question. At Rand, researchers moved away from material specificity, from the details, into the realms of abstract models and techniques that they hoped would apply to whatever those future wars ended up being. One of the techniques that was developed there was called systems engineering, and it was the view that you could abstract away from the world all kinds of systems. Governments could be seen as systems, transportation infrastructure could be seen as a system, weapons could be seen as a system, sewage, agriculture, all of these elements of organized social life could be seen as systems. And what matters in a system is the relationships between parts, what information travels between them, what mathematical relationships obtain between them, rather than the specific materials or people that constitute it. So even if you couldn't know many of the details, the who, the when, the how future wars would be fought, at Rand, they believed that you could know how to strategize for any war by modeling the systems that are involved and looking for ways to optimize their performance, to streamline the information that moves between them, to optimize the relationships between the parts in the abstract sense. These books on the slide are some of the important works that track the genealogy of systems thinking and of systems engineering, as well as the many roads by which systems thinking traveled from the defense establishment, places like the Rand Corporation, into domestic governance and planning. Systems engineering was first turned outward towards America's enemies, and then it was turned inward towards America's people. My second book project actually explores how systems thinking shaped the early introduction of computers to domestic policing in the 1960s, but that's a story for another day. So Newell and Simon worked within and helped to shape the systems engineering view of the world. In the abstract, where material specificity mattered much less than the mathematical relations of parts, than the circulation of information. And they came to believe, somewhat infamously, that both the human mind and the modern digital computer were systems too, and that they should also be studied as systems in the abstract. And moreover, as Simon famously said, the mind and the modern digital computer were the same kind of system, species of the same genus, specifically the genus information processor. Newell and Simon believed that computers were the same kind of thing. They were systems that took in symbolic information as input and then manipulated it according to a set of rules in order to output the solution to a problem, a judgment, a decision, various other valences of supposedly intelligent behavior. This was a theory of intelligence where the material did not matter. It could be brains, it could be bodies, it could be computers, it could be hybrid organizations of humans and machines. As long as you had a system that could take symbolic information as input, manipulate it according to the right set of rules, if you had a system that could do that, whatever its constitution, you would have intelligence. This was an abstract model of the thing. And in fact, Newell and Simon went so far as to say that until you had an abstract model of the information processes involved, you didn't understand the human behavior in the first place. Understanding human intelligence for them was a project of identifying the rules of manipulating information that they believed were at work in different intelligent behavior. They wrote, quote, "We wish to emphasize that we are not using computers as a crude analogy to human behavior. Our position is that the appropriate way to describe a piece of problem-solving behavior is in terms of a program. In terms of certain elementary information processes it is capable of performing." This assertion has nothing to do directly with computers. Computers come into the picture only because they can, by appropriate programming, be induced to execute the same sequences of information processes that humans execute when they are solving problems. Hence, programs describe both human and machine problem solving at the level of information processes, end quote. They were advocates for abstraction, for a vision of human intelligence and intelligent behavior as being constituted by a set of rule-bound steps, rule-bound information processes, and that these could be executed independent of the materiality of embodiment of machinery, as long as you had a system that could be made to follow the same information processing rules. It could be made to produce the same intelligent behavior. At the abstract level, at a distance from the vantage point of the systems engineer, these behaviors were the same. And the logic theory machine was their first attempt to actually identify and then automate the information processes of a particular domain of human reasoning. Specifically, the logic theory machine was designed to prove theorems from an early 20th century text in mathematical logic, namely Principia Mathematica, that was written by two English mathematicians, Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell, around the turn of the 20th century. And in these texts, these volumes, is laid out a system of deductive logic, a set of axioms, a set of principles for inference or inference rules that Whitehead and Russell hoped would be all that you needed in principle to derive the theorems from various branches of mathematics. Of course, unfortunately, this turned out not to be the case, but when they published Principia Mathematica, that was their hope. So in order to develop the logic theory machine, Newell and Simon first needed a theory or a model of what it is that humans do when they prove mathematical theorems or logical propositions. What are the information processing rules that need to be followed in order to reproduce that intelligent behavior in the machine? And for their model of human logical problem-solving behavior, they turned to a mathematician by the name of George Polya, who was a Hungarian who fled to the United States in 1940, and with whom Newell took every class he could when he was an undergraduate at Stanford. And Polya, in addition to being a research mathematician, was also deeply interested in mathematics pedagogy. He was interested in how we teach students to be mathematicians, to think mathematically. And Polya believed, contrary to some of the idealizations or myths of mathematics, that mathematicians don't just deduce consequences from axioms in search of interesting true theorems. They don't just apply the rules of inference mechanically and churn out true statements. They do all kinds of other things. They start from the thing that they want to prove and they work backwards, looking for related problems. They experiment with cases. They look for analogies. They build models and counterexamples. They have all kinds of tricks. And Polya, contrary to some other thinking in the 20th century, did not think that the tricks that mathematicians used were esoteric, inarticulable, tacit, undescribable secrets of the experienced mathematician. He thought these tricks could be identified, articulated, formalized, made explicit, and even that they could be presented as rules. He called them rules for plausible inference, and that these rules could be taught to students of mathematics to make them better at actually doing mathematical problem solving and theorem proving. He wrote in 1954, certainly let us learn proving, that is, let us learn how to deduce consequences from axioms, but also let us learn guessing. Let us learn how to take a step that is not certain in mathematical problem solving, but have good reason to believe that we're making progress towards a solution to our problem. And he called these ways of guessing, these rules for plausible inference, heuristics, after the Greek word heurischein, which is a navigational term. The word is to find. So this was perfect for Newell and Simon because what they wanted was a set of rules that characterized actual human problem-solving behavior. And Polya had in fact published several books about the rules that he believed mathematicians followed when they proceeded in theorem proving and problem solving. So the logic theory machine was not ambitious in one sense. It only automated 2 heuristic rules for mathematical problem solving. But Newell and Simon believed that those heuristics really captured something about how humans solve problems in logic, and that these could be translated into a computer program. So the logic theory machine did not begin from the axioms of logic and work forward by deduction, hoping to deduce the theorems from Principia Mathematica. This, of course, would, and in fact did, produce an exponential explosion of data and had been ruled out as a possibility for practical theorem proving earlier in the 1950s. But instead, the logic theory machine worked backwards through what I've called a kind of inferential reverse engineering of a sorts. The logic theory machine started with the logical proposition that it wanted to prove, and then it generated a set of so-called subproblems that, if they were true, would lead to the desired conclusion in one step. And then it would generate subproblems for those subproblems, and so on, in hopes that eventually the axioms and the database of already proven theorems would be generated as subproblems. If that happened, then you could run that series in the reverse direction, and you would have a nice deductive proof that started from the axioms and ended with the theorem that would constitute a proof as desired. Newell and Simon acknowledged that this was only a first step in modeling the complex ways that humans prove theorems, but they thought it was a very good start. And the logic theory machine was most famous for this heuristic approach to problem solving, which was taken up later by AI practitioners and applied to other domains well into the 1980s. The logic theory machine was actually the only operational program that was presented at the infamous 1956 Dartmouth Summer School for Artificial Intelligence. And so it had a kind of outsized impact on early researchers who thought, yes, it's heuristics that we need. I'll go to try to identify the heuristics for human intelligent problem solving in chemistry, in medical diagnosis, other domains, in hopes of producing artificial intelligence by the automation of these heuristic rules. So this model of human problem solving by rules of plausible inference, heuristic problem solving practices, was the model of human problem solving practice that Newell and Simon wanted to automate in the logic theory machine. And that's where the story usually ends. But models and abstractions alone don't compute. Models are not enough for computing. They had to figure out how to implement this model of human problem solving so that it could run on Rand's Joniac mainframe computer that had all of 52 kilobytes of memory. And this is the part of the story that I like the most, because even though Newell and Simon thought that materiality was irrelevant and were only interested in this abstract level of formal problem solving, they nonetheless had to reckon with materiality in order to have a functional program. They had to find a way to execute these heuristics on the Joniac computer with its very limited resources. They needed to translate those heuristics into the kind of thing that a computer can do, into its memory, its operations. And they developed, in fact, a whole new programming language, a new set of data structures and information processing techniques called linked lists and list processing operations that were actually quite inhuman in their structures and their processes. What was meant to be a very human, a precisely human, in fact, approach to automated problem solving became quite inhuman and alien in the transition to implementation. And throughout my work, I've advocated that historians and critics and theorists of computing not just direct their gaze at the abstractions and algorithms and models of AI about which so many stories are told, but to actually look at what happens when abstraction meets the machine, when the machine has to be accommodated. We can't accept or assume the irrelevance of materiality, embodiment, and practice, especially where researchers we study are trying to erase it. Very tellingly, I think neither Alan Newell nor Herbert Simon, for all of the celebration we do of their early contributions, actually knew how to use computers well enough to implement their model on the machine. To get the logic theory machine up and running, they had to enlist the support of a third collaborator who gets a lot less press, namely John Clifford Shaw. After the Second World War, Shaw came to the RAND Corporation to work in the numerical analysis department. And Shaw actually recounted to Pamela McCorduck, who did a series of interviews with early AI practitioners in the US, that the numerical analysis department was in the basement of the building. It was the only space large enough to accommodate giant mainframe computing machinery at the time. And the machines were large and loud and hot. And they actually ended up calling that space the sweatshop. They worked without shirts on, with so much heat and noise. They were packing boxes of punch cards back and forth between the machinery. It was a loud, hot, physical space, quite in contrast with the realm of abstractions where Simon thought the real work was happening. Shaw was actually very skeptical of the fact or the idea that the computer was doing anything particularly human. And it seems the closer you are to the computer and the more your expertise attaches to what the computer is actually doing, the less convinced you might be by these abstract claims about similarities between the human mind and these massive machines. So with Shaw's help, they were able to turn the logic theory machine into a running program. People like Shaw, who were working in the numerical analysis department, which was later renamed the programming department, were the ones who literally got their hands dirty with computing machinery, implementing and executing the calculations and simulations and models involved in other RAND research programs. But in implementing the logic theory machine on the Johnniac, the program took on some very inhuman forms of computer operations and data structures that people really struggle to work with. And the analogy between the two disappears almost entirely at the level of materiality. I'm not going to get too much into these details. I had published a piece about this ages ago that talks about the implementation of the logic theory machine and the quite inhuman operations and representational schemes that were developed in order to accommodate the machine that Newell and Simon so fervently proposed was secondary, even irrelevant to the question of intelligence. However, just very briefly, in order to actualize their vision of the logic theory machine, logical propositions had to be represented in computer memory in a way that was expedient and accommodated the strict constraints of 52 kilobytes available to work with. And what they came up with was the now totally ubiquitous linked list encoding as a way of representing logical propositions in computer memory. So in a linked list encoding, every element of a logical proposition was represented by a set of values, each of which was allocated a set of bits in computer memory. And those values would specify things like, is this a logical proposition, a variable, an operator? Is it negated? What position does it hold in the proposition, and so on. And in the last set of those bits, labeled Q, the capital Q in the top right-hand corner diagram there, an address, a numeric address was stored for where in computer memory the next logical operator or variable from the proposition was being stored or represented. And the idea was that you didn't have to have a whole contiguous chunk of bits in computer memory to store the entirety of your logical proposition, but rather you could store each of the elements of a proposition somewhere completely different in computer memory where there happened to be memory available, and that the proposition would be held together by a list of these address pointers that dynamically signal to the computer where in memory the next element of the proposition could be found. This was to really pare down on the housekeeping calculations of doing backward chaining and these heuristic programming techniques. For example, if you want to delete an element from a logical proposition represented as a linked list, rather than writing out the whole proposition again, finding memory in which to do so with one fewer element, you could actually just reroute the address pointer from the previous variable or element to the next one in computer memory. And this turned logical propositions into dynamic, easily manipulable representational structures, but ones that people would really struggle to work with. And I've sort of tried to do so. There's nothing human about linked lists and about list processing operations of this kind. And so under the hood in the implementation, this human-based model of cognition ends up taking these deeply inhuman forms. But of course, for Newell and Simon, that was utterly beside the point, because materiality and implementation were not where they were focused. They were interested in abstract models and a much higher level or vision of what information processing entailed, not caring about what's actually going on in the brain or the body or in the computer when these information processes are executed. And this vision of human problem solving is based in heuristics, list processing, and linked list operations. Eventually became the Lisp programming language and had a very dominant influence on early AI in the US. As I said, everybody then went looking for heuristic rules in different problem-solving domains to translate into computer programs, often using linked lists and list processing operations to produce so-called artificial intelligence. But there were also those who rejected this vision and critiqued early AI in the United States. And among them was the Chinese-American logician Hao Wang. Wang was a philosopher, specifically a logician, but over the course of his career, he became deeply critical of both analytic philosophy and logic, in part because he felt that those abstractions in which both analytic philosophy and logic trafficked were just fictions, that they were being treated as real, but that they bore so little resemblance to the realities they were abstracted from to be useful. He was concerned that the abstractions at the heart of analytic philosophy and logic and early artificial intelligence did not grab a hold of enough reality to honor or to guide the messy and contingent experiences of embodied and political human life. Wang entered philosophy to study what he called the human dilemma, but found little in the abstractions of analytic philosophy and logic that resonated with his experience of it. Wang proposed that Newell and Simon and those who approached the problem of AI as they did had made a fundamental mistake. They had believed a fiction about the human mind that led them to mistakenly see the computer as the same kind of thing. He wrote, quote, "Logicians had worked with the fiction of man as a persistent and unimaginative beast who can only follow rules blindly. Then the fiction found its incarnation in the machine," end quote. It was an understandable mistake, Wang thought, because human minds had been so often idealized and abstracted and modeled in philosophy and logic as rule-following entities, especially by his predecessors in logic and analytic philosophy, who had sought to reduce human reasoning and human thinking to a rule-bound formalism. and who had in turn associated embodiment and emotion with irrationality, irrelevant or worse, an impediment to right reasoning. His predecessors, he thought, wanted to partition up the human being into separate, independent faculties. Reasoning was one that could, if it was working properly, be abstracted away from everything else that was going on in the human body, the human heart, the human mind. One crucial tenet of these theories of the mind was a presumed universalism, the belief that the same set of rules for reasoning and problem solving and rational thought were at work across problem domains, across human minds, across contexts and histories, and as well within machines programmed to be intelligent. So if you're reasoning in chemistry, if you're reasoning in law, if you're reasoning in mathematics, if you're reasoning in medicine, there was a belief that the same rule-bound processes were at work in the mind. And logic was an effort over centuries to distill what those universal rules were, that claimed to be descriptive, although often they were, in fact, normative accounts of how people should think rather than descriptions of how people do think. One of the core claims made by historians of science over the last several decades has been that this purportedly universal faculty called reasoning was in fact reserved primarily for educated white and European and American men who simultaneously denied the capacity for right reason to many people. Women, colonized people, enslaved people, people of color and of other parts of the world were often characterized in the European and American canon as irrational, as unreasonable, as superstitious, as physiologically incapable of the mental discipline required for right reasoning. And so reason has had this tension built into it, at least since the European Enlightenment, if not earlier, in that it is purported to be a universal faculty that undergirds huge swaths of human capability. And yet reasoning has been used to deny the faculty of reasoning to so many people. Many logicians working at the turn of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead and George Boole among them, claimed to be engaged, as I said, in a descriptive project, revealing the rules of reasoning that were at work in the mind. Newell and Simon continued and extended this project, claiming that their research first revealed the rules that were already at work in intelligent human behavior, and then translated those rules into a program, ran it on a machine, called it intelligence. However, these rules were, in fact, born out of what I think and what many of these historians claim were normative projects, even coercive ones, in which the universality of reason was created by the disciplining of mental acts and the rejection of nonconformity as irrational or unreasonable. But artificial intelligence researchers in the 1950s believed the fiction that reasoning was universal across people, across problem domains, across countries, across historical periods, and that it consisted in rule following. Lorraine Daston, I should add, just had her new book come out on the history of rules and rule following. It's just called Rules. It should be on this slide, but I haven't added it yet. It's a wonderful book on the history of the centrality of rule following to so many parts of Western organized society. So this theory of reason as a universal rule-bound enterprise, especially in the hands of early AI practitioners, as we saw, was also inherently abstract. It didn't matter what material system enacted the rules, a human brain, a human body, a machine, a company, a hybrid organization of humans and machines. So long as it followed the right rules, that system would be reasoning intelligent. Wang, however, had a different theory of human reason. He rejected both the abstraction and the universalism assumed in these philosophical fictions of the mind. Human thinking, he believed, was contingent, individual, historical, embodied. It was shaped by the specific experiences of the thinker. He wrote, A particular act of recognition or reasoning depends on one's genes, the history of one's mind and body, some essential relation to desire, even race, class, sex, and many other factors. Of most of these factors, we have at best an imperfect knowledge and understanding, end quote. Human reasoning could not be reduced to a universal formalism, Wang believed, because each person's reasoning faculty develops uniquely according to numerous only partially understood factors. The way we think, Wang claims, has as much to do with what you ate that morning and where you went to school as it does with these universal abstract rules that logicians imagined governed everybody's intelligent thinking. And Wang also claimed that all of these things that actually constitute the reality of human thinking, we don't understand them. History is complicated, so is embodiment, so is politics. And so Wang brought this critique to early artificial intelligence of the universality of reason as well as its rule-boundedness. That was a prolific foundational idea for early AI research. Very recently, race and technology scholars like Yarden Katz and Andre Brock have explored how universal often actually just means white. Wang did not couch his critique of universal reason in a theory of race, but there are some important parallels that I wanted to mention. Brock writes, quote, that whiteness, it is itself signified as universal, raceless, technocultural identity. As white folks' communications, letters, and works of art are rarely understood as white, instead they become universal and understood as communication, literature, and art, end quote. Whereas Black art, Hispanic art are specified as such and not assumed to be universal. The only bodies of work that have attained the status of universality, assumed to be relevant always and everywhere, are the ones that were produced primarily by Western European, Anglo-Saxon, and imperial cultures. Similarly, reason, as the mechanism thought central to knowledge production, truth claims, and other intelligent behaviors, was fashioned in mathematical logic and in early artificial intelligence as universal, but it was, in fact, as other scholars like Alison Adam has explored, distilled from some of the most white and male-dominated domains like mathematics and chess. Earlier practitioners of AI, themselves overwhelmingly white and male, imagined that all they needed to do to understand intelligence and reason was to observe themselves, documenting and publishing a number of techniques like introspection and reasoning aloud, believing that this would suffice for the identification of universal reason. That all they would need to do is observe themselves solving problems or observe other people like them solving problems in math, logic, chess, language problems. And in so doing, they would be able to abstract and articulate a universal theory of reason and problem solving. Yarden Katz writes in Artificial Whiteness, quote, like whiteness, AI aspired to be totalizing, to say something definitive about the limits and potential of human life based on racialized and gendered models of the self that are falsely presented as universal. So in many ways, Wang's rejection of universal reason anticipated a number of today's humanist critiques of AI and the stories that it tells about the human mind. His rejection of universal reason was grounded in part in his training in materialist philosophy in China, which is where he grew up and completed his first 2 degrees, and in his engagement with both Marxist and Maoist thought during the Cold War. Wang thought that Marxism, unlike analytic philosophy, was well suited to the study of the so-called human dilemma, because rather than abstracting them away, Marx wanted at least to engage with materiality and history and embodiment, and offered a very different theory of social change, a guide to action. Wang thought this was a philosophy that was actually useful. He wrote, quote, "Although there was much that puzzled me in Marxism, I felt I saw a comprehensive philosophy unifying thought and action in a way that I had not before considered possible." And it was this desire that Wang had to bridge thought and action, to make abstraction more useful, to make philosophy honor and guide real life rather than deal with fictions and abstractions, that brought Wang to his interest in computers in the first place. He saw the modern digital computer not as anything similar to the human at all, but rather as deeply different in ways that might be productive. He wrote, quote, "The human inability to command precisely any great mass of details sets an intrinsic limitation on the kind of thing that is done in mathematics and the manner in which it is done. The superiority of machines in this respect indicates that machines, while following the broad outline of paths drawn up by man, might yield surprising new results by making many new turns which man is not accustomed to taking. We are in fact faced with a challenge to devise methods of buying originality with plodding, now that we are in possession of slaves which are such persistent plodders." This was not AI. This was not the reproduction of human cognitive faculties in the machine. This was buying originality with plodding. Whereas Newell and Simon had recognized an incarnation of the fiction of the intelligent human mind as rule-bound reasoners in the computer, Wang recognized instead the abstract idea of the slave. Inhuman, rule-obeying, and mindless, that's the fiction that dehumanized violent fiction that didn't apply to those actual people any more than these universal theories of reason do. It was a fiction that was also untrue, and violently so, of enslaved people, that they were inhuman, rule-obeying, lacking in the mind, right? Industrial capitalism, I suggest in my book, was actually predicated on both fictions, on the universality of reason, according to which manufacture, management, and bureaucracy relied, and on the machine-likeness of workers in the factory or enslaved on the plantation, who would be disciplined and punished to behave as machine-like as possible. Wang wanted to know what could be done with this technological manifestation of both of these abstract fictions, what inhuman feats might the machine accomplish, and what epistemic possibilities were opened in tandem. So in the late 1950s, Wang was lecturing in philosophy at both Harvard and Oxford universities, but driven by his dissatisfaction with analytic philosophy and logic, he spent his summers at IBM and Bell Research Labs and the Burroughs Corporation, where he also developed a set of computer programs for proving theorems from Principia Mathematica, everybody's favorite logical treatise at the time. So in his critique of analytic philosophy, Wang was particularly disappointed by the fact that not even mathematicians seemed to have much use for mathematical logic. He was in the business of developing and exploring and studying formal systems that were thought to be foundational to mathematics, but that not even mathematicians could easily or readily make use of. He wrote, quote, "A common complaint among mathematicians is that logicians, when engaged in formalization, are largely concerned with hair splitting. It is sufficient to know that proofs can be formalized. Why should one take all the trouble to show exactly how such formalizations are to be done, or even to carry out actual formalizations?" End quote. Russell and Whitehead, of course, famously or maybe infamously didn't get around to proving that 1 + 1 = 2 until more than 200 pages into Principia Mathematica, to give you a sense of how cumbersome it was to work within these formal systems. And Wang was really disappointed by this. Not only did he think the whole apparatus of analytic philosophy was really struggling to give people useful, practical, in the daily sense, understandings of the human condition, but even in logic, it didn't seem that mathematicians could make use of these abstractions. And this was what Wang thought was promising about the modern digital computer. He thought maybe computers computers can make logic more useful. Maybe it offers a way for doing the work of mathematics with the tools of abstraction made newly useful through the power of computation. What if there is more potential in the abstractions of mathematical logic than we had otherwise known even to look for? And that is what Wang wanted to use computers for, not to represent or reflect anything about the human mind, but to see if he could find a way to make the abstractions of mathematical logic, his home discipline, more useful for actually doing mathematical work. So his approach to proving theorems from Principia Mathematica was not based on a theory of how humans do it, but was rather based on a fundamental result from a branch of logic called proof theory, namely Herbrand's theorem, which was proved by a French logician, Jacques Herbrand, just before his very young, untimely death in a mountaineering accident. And Herbrand's theorem offers a mechanism for proving theorems in one branch of logic described in Principia, namely the predicate calculus, in terms of a simpler branch, namely the propositional calculus. The details here are of more and less interest to different audiences, so I wasn't sure, so I'll give you a taste, but if people want a more in-depth explanation of how this worked, I would be happy to give you one. But the theorem is as follows. For any statement P from the predicate calculus, Herbrand's theorem gives us a method for producing a corresponding infinite series of statements in the propositional calculus, which is a simpler branch of logic. And then the theorem states that P is a theorem if and only if, for some number n, the first n of those elements, those s's, connected by the or operator into what's called a disjunctive series, is a tautology, meaning that it's true no matter what values are substituted for S1, S2, S3, and so on. And notice that to have a disjunctive tautology, you only ever need one of those statements to be true at a time. Either S1 has to be true, or S2, or S3, or S4, but one of them has to be true for any value assignment in order to get the tautology that you want. So one way to search for a proof would be to test if that S is a tautology for n equals 1, n equals 2, and so on. And if P is a theorem, eventually a tautology could be discovered and therefore a proof. But of course, Herbrand's theorem was never meant to be an actual method for proving theorems. Even in really simple cases, you might have to check trillions of cases before you find a tautology. And in some cases, you can calculate an upper bound on n, but even still, there are way too many cases for a person to check reliably. And worse, if P is not a theorem and you don't know that, you could go on forever, never knowing if the next case would be a tautology. And of course, it never would be. Herbrand's theorem is a particular kind of result. It's a statement, an abstract statement about the relationship between two branches of logic. And even though it gives a method for proving theorems, no person could ever actually apply it. But Wang thought, what if the computer could? And so Herbrand's theorem was the model for his program. He wanted to figure out if there was a way to use Herbrand's theorem in new ways that could be useful for the computer, even if not for a person. He wanted to bridge thought and action, bridge abstraction and practice. And in the end, he found quite a remarkable way to do this, and one that shows us that, in fact, logic is not this universal deductive turning of the crank, but it is mercurial and creative, and we need only look at Wang's work to believe that. There's more to be done with these formal systems. Logic leaves a lot of space for creative rethinking. It was not some guarantor of universal truth, but rather a set of systems whose character evolved alongside the set of questions that researchers came to ask of it. And that evolved as the materials of mathematical practice changed from paper to calculator to computer. And Wang proposed that we could come up with new questions about logical formalisms because of computers, one that we would never even think to look for if we were bounded by our sense of what it is the human mind does. So Wang's programs for proving theorems from Principia, he called a method of proof by pattern recognition, through which he exploited structural properties of Erbrand's theorem that were previously unknown, unnoticed, and probably irrelevant to program computers to look for proofs of P. The secret that he discovered, and again, I can say a lot more about this if anyone's interested, was that those S's in question, because of how they're generated, they share variables. So the same variable might appear in S1, but also S8. And remember that for this disjunction to be a tautology, you only ever need one of the S's to be true for any given variable assignment. So the computer, under Wang's direction, set out to try and look for variable assignments that would make all of the S's false. But what if, because S1 and S8 share a variable, every time I try to make S1 false, I say S1 is false by assigning falsifying values to its variables, it forces S8 to be true. And there are a lot of logical operations that have these types of quirks, like implication. The only way to falsify an implication function is to have false on the left-hand side and true on the right-hand side. So what if every time I try to falsify S1 and it's an implication statement, I force S8 to be true because that variable appears on the other side of the implication operator? So it's tricks like that that allowed Wang to mine Erbrand's theorem for these falsifying assignments and ways of testing for them. What if in every case, when I try to falsify one S, I force another one to be true? That would give you a way to find the tautology you wanted, or maybe to show that no tautology was possible. And that was the basic intuition behind Wang's programs. He developed a method for looking at the finite number of ways that S's of different forms could be falsified, and then checking if those falsifications always forced truth onto some other S. And you could use those structural properties to actually prove theorems in the predicate calculus, albeit by contradiction, assuming no tautology was possible, and then looking at how attempts to falsify all the S's actually creates a tautology in some cases. He called this a method for pattern recognition. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little over time, but I'm just about done. But these, of course, were not patterns that people could see. These were algorithmic patterns that the computer could check for, but that often required the discharging of even trillions of cases before you could figure it out. Wang's notebooks in his archive are full of these empty tables that gesture to the method without being able to actually perform it. This was not a reproduction of human practice, but rather Wang came to Erbrand's theorem with a new perspective, one grounded in what the computer could do. And he found in the theorem new structural information about logic, about these S's that hadn't been appreciated before. It was a very powerful method. It proved way more theorems from Principia than the logic theory machine, and in considerably less time. But it was not a mathematician, it was not a colleague, it was not human-like in any way, quite the opposite. Wang used the inhuman possibilities of the computer to see how possibilities in Erbrand's theorem maybe hadn't been appreciated before, and to find ways of making it useful for actually proving theorems, rather than just making an abstract statement about the relationship between these two branches of logic, as it had previously been. So whereas Newell and Simon wanted to recreate human practice in the machine, Wang wanted to keep human creativity and ingenuity and understanding and knowledge central to working with computers. Buying originality with plotting was only possible when you came with fresh eyes to old tools. This was not about reproducing or replacing the human knower, but rather encouraging a creativity and ingenuity in people to try and bring ideas into more meaningful contact with practice and experience and action. It was this same desire for thought and action to be aligned, the same desire for abstraction and philosophy to do justice to what we know, rather than abstracting away until the world and the human become unrecognizable, that brought Wang to the study of computers and also to Marxist philosophy. To conclude, I wanted to share some notes about Wang's life. In 1956, he was sailing between New York and London, between Harvard and Oxford, but was stopped because he was found to be transporting undeclared electronics components that exceeded the limit after an unknown colleague reported him to the FBI, saying he was planning to transport electronics to China for the purpose of nuclear arms development. That was not at all the case. None of the components were controlled as nuclear secrets. All were very standard for computing, and Wang was in fact transporting them for a friend, a fellow Chinese American who was going back to China, and feared, because he had already been subjected to the cruelties of McCarthy-era surveillance, that he would not be able to bring them himself and would be unable to continue his research. Wang was also found at the time, as you'll see in this Freedom of Information Act requested document, to have had a number of Marxist pamphlets and literature in his suitcases. And this image of him sailing between arguably the two most analytic philosophy departments on the planet at the time, namely Harvard and Oxford, with a suitcase full of computer parts and Marxist literature, I think captures something about the fundamental tensions in Wang's experience of the Cold War world. And in the early 1970s, following a kind of rapprochement between China and the US, Wang was one of the earliest visitors to China and became a public defender of Mao and Maoist domestic philosophy and policy. He penned many letters to the editor defending Mao and Marxism and urged the study of Marxism in America. He said at the big East-West Philosophers Conference in Honolulu in 1973, quote, Wang said Chinese Marxism applies philosophy to transportation, weather forecasts, treating broken backs, keeping vegetables fresh, delivering letters, and raising peanut yields. He contrasted these examples to Western philosophy's abstractions and contradictions, end quote. And this is what Wang wanted: ideas that worked in the world, ideas that applied to the human dilemma, ideas that were a guide to action, rather than the abstractions and fictions and contradictions at the heart of Chinese, or of analytic philosophy. Wang eventually, though, abandoned his commitment to Marxism and Maoism once some of the realities of life in Mao's new China emerged. At the end of his life, he was deeply depressed and heavy of heart that maybe none of our knowledge, none of our theories and models of history, change, the human dilemma, could do justice to the lived reality. He wrote in 1993, just before he died, that from 1977 on, a Chinese glasnost reevaluated a certain number of the views of the Cultural Revolution and earlier. In particular was the revelation from private conversations and literary works of many concrete facts about which most persons before had no idea. After coming across such information, I began to doubt my own recent views. I felt that due to my deeply rooted and stubborn patriotic thinking, I had imagined certain facts that were grounded in wishful thinking. Upon this foundation, I had erected a logical construction that was really a castle in the sky, end quote. And I think Wang's late life reflections are instructive both in their humility, quite different from the hubris that moves through a lot of AI then and now, but also in his disappointment. I know in my own communities, a lot of scholars are feeling really frustrated these days that our scholarship, our ideas, our critiques, and our histories and our theories of change and our models don't and maybe can't do the work in the world that we hope that they would to scaffold better futures and ways of living. They don't serve as a guide to action. And I think we remain very much trapped in the same set of questions about how our philosophies and our ideas apply to our world. He lamented the fact that abstractions and fictions in philosophy tended not to be useful because they were so disconnected from the human experience. And Wang's alternative theory of human reason, not as universal and rule-bound, but rather as individual, contingent, embodied, and historical, that theory came with an alternative vision of knowledge as well. And this is, I think, the concluding thought, and the most important thing I want to say in my book is that so many Enlightenment thinkers and their intellectual descendants, including AI researchers, suggested that our knowledge has to be a product of that universal reasoning faculty, even though we know that it is not so universal. Anything produced otherwise, they said, would not in fact be knowledge. But if that universal reasoning faculty is a myth, and quite inhuman, in fact, as Wang believed, then we are in trouble. The message is that our knowledge is only as good as we can be inhuman in its production. Knowledge is what follows the turn of the crank, the suppression of so much of what human life and experience actually involve. And I think a lot of the sort of anxieties we're dealing with around knowledge and what's true and who to trust and the erosion of expertise are in part a byproduct of this sort of long history of trying to abstract away so much from the human condition as to make knowledge claims that are independent of the material conditions that created them. So with my apologies for going over, I will stop there, and thank you so much for your time. And I welcome any and all thoughts as I am sort of revising the book manuscript that explores all these things in more detail.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for this trip in the 50s, the cradle of AI, the discovery of forgotten and yet determining personalities like Georges Polya or Ao Wang, and the picture of the concrete condition of the birth of the computer science. I entered totally in your territory for me. Thank you also for evocating the figure of Herbrand, tragic one and very important for our as French, as a French. You know, there is a room in the École Normale Supérieure called Herbrand room. So there is maybe study to be done further into the figure of Herbrand. And thank you also for your critique of the abstraction of universal logic and the idea of transforming the human mind into machines. It's fascinating. And I think at the time, everyone is speaking of GPT, the political implication, the political stakes of your analysis of the very beginning of the AI are very important. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If there is a question in the room, please use the Zoom emoticon to ask for a question.
I have one.
Yeah, to yourself. Okay.
I have never had access to a community of French logicians or historians or philosophers, and so I don't know if there is French language. I know there isn't any good English language work on Herbrand and his life and his work and his but I wondered if there is French language work on him, because I can manage, I could struggle through it, but I've never even known, because he is so important and there isn't any real historical scholarship about him.
The only thing I found was a very long page on the École Normale Supérieure website. I will send you to you, but I didn't find more than that. But maybe I have to look into the library of École Normale Supérieure to find more. But there is some very moving pictures of Herbrand going to the Alps before dying. I try to find the link and send it just to you. Just a moment.
Thank you.
Yes, Nazim, for a question.
Yes, good evening. So thank you, Alexandre, and thank you very much for this beautiful and inspiring talk. So I was very, very interested by all the teams and by Ao Wang. I have many questions, but I have to restrict myself to one question. So I just want to ask you about the sound. Is the sound good or?
It's perfect, perfect.
Okay, good. So my question is, what do you think of the critiques of artificial intelligence that were emitted by Hubert Dreyfus? And how would you situate these critiques with regard to those emitted by Ao Wang?
That's a really great question. I would really love to read a book, if anyone has the energy to write it, that just surveys the early critics, you know? So Dreyfus and Weizenbaum and people like Wang, and just sort of got a taxonomy of where their where their critiques were. So I think what I would say in response to the question, and I don't know Dreyfus's work nearly as well as Wang, so it's a bit unfair. I think that Dreyfus's critiques of AI are much bigger in scope, that he really recognized how dangerous it could be to assume that computers were capable of doing certain types of decision-making, especially that they aren't capable of doing, or pretending that they are. I think for Wang, he was just really annoyed at how quickly people in AI articulated this deep similarity between people's minds and the machines, and he just didn't believe that was true. And also, I think, unlike Dreyfus, Wang loved the computer. I think he thought there was real epistemic power in having a tool that was so inhuman and capable of doing so much more than what the human mind could do. Whereas Dreyfus, I feel, was always emphasizing that we are better than we think, and that our ability to make decisions, the social and political processes that are involved in formulating knowledge and making judgments and formulating decisions, are actually really powerful. And Wang was sort of interested in what the computer could do that was in fact deeply inhuman, but he wanted us to sort of stay in the driver's seat and make sure that we were always serving our own understanding of logic, for example, while coming up with ways to get computers to do it. So I think it's fair to say that Wang does not level a kind of universal critique in the way that Dreyfus does about what all of the implications would be. He just rejected the premise, essentially, of what early AI was doing. But I think that what Wang is most famous for in his own career was the fact that in the 70s, he did this series of interviews with the logician Kurt Gödel, who before his death had a lot of had been reflecting a lot on what the significance of the incompleteness theorems might be for the philosophy of mind. And so Wang wanted to know from Gödel, how do you make sense of the fact that human minds don't seem to be constrained by the incompleteness results, and that we can go along and solve problems and do work in non-decidable domains and all of these things? And Gödel, you know, in his answers is a little all over the place, but he just, again, really wants to reject any notion that the mind is a Turing machine, or that it is constrained by the same formal limits that constrain mathematical formal systems. And so I feel like Gödel and Wang are having this very inward-looking conversation about reasoning, whereas Dreyfus has just like a more prolific, larger scale critique of both that computers aren't as reliable as decision makers and can't do some of the things that are required for settling disputes or formulating decisions, but also that he really had a vision of what would happen to the world if we started offloading decision-making capabilities onto the machine. And I would place him maybe in a similar camp to Weizenbaum at MIT, who again which is the order from reason to judgment, where he wants to hold certain types of thinking and decision making uniquely for the human mind because it's different from the machine. It's a social political engine rather than built on understanding, rather than some kind of rule-bound formalism. So I'm rambling, but I guess they're all related. But I think Wang's is actually a much more narrow critique in many ways from Dreyfus's.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
To go in the same direction, I'd like to ask you, do you think that these first controversies help us, enlightened us to the present debate on AI ethics, AI discrimination, the abstract model of the human you try to critique?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think about this a lot, and I don't always have the best answer. So, of course, what happens eventually is that this whole, I guess my sort of history of the history of AI or something, it will go, in the beginning, everybody is trying to automate reasoning in some way, and they're modeling the human mind, and they're trying to come up with models that capture human problem solving and then automate those. And then the sort of next big paradigm in American AI comes out of Edward Feigenbaum's critique of the idea that human intelligence inheres in reasoning. So Edward Feigenbaum at Stanford says, I don't know why all these people thought that the only thing required for human intelligence is reasoning, but we clearly need more than that. We need knowledge too, that human intelligence inheres in what we know as much as in our reasoning faculty. So the whole expert systems world is trying to encode human knowledge and build databases of automated human knowing. And all of these projects, as we know, kind of fail, they're oversold. And then by the time we get to the 80s and 90s, what I see is this desire to bypass the human altogether. And so the bottleneck that's created from having to interview human experts in order to encode their knowledge becomes so expensive, basically precipitates the so-called AI winter, even though I don't find that all that helpful. And then the sort of early advent of machine learning, one of the things that people love about it is that it doesn't need people. That's the whole, that's the whole game, is that what if we can speed this up and have machines figure out the rules all on their own? We don't have to tell them how to know or what to know or how to reason. We can just give machine learning systems these massive databases and let it find its own patterns. And I think what a lot of people celebrated about machine learning, in addition to its sort of efficiency gains or accuracy gains or cost gains, was that it bypassed people. And I think from there's so much to say about machine learning, and all of the critiques are essential. But one of the things that I find really sad about it, everybody's always mad at how much arrogance or hubris there is in contemporary AI, that people in machine learning don't seem to think they need any domain-specific expertise. They can just gather up the data and produce machine learning for medical diagnosis, or machine learning for this, or machine learning for that. And there is like so much arrogance in it. And yet when I look at AI, what I see instead is really low self-esteem. Like, these people have no faith in human knowing and are always quick to say, people are too limited, people don't understand, people are too slow, people have too many feelings, people have to eat, people have to sleep. So in the Industrial Revolution, we're not good enough workers. In the Cold War, we're not good enough decision makers. Today, we are hopeless about data practices, and what I hopeless in our limitations. We could never deal with all the data that we now have, and there's all this low self-esteem about people. And what I actually love the most about Hao Wang's early critique is how celebratory of human ingenuity it is. So even though he sees a place for the computer in knowledge making and in logic and in philosophy, he wants it to be showing us new things that we can understand. He really centered both human ingenuity in designing and imagining what kinds of things the computer could do, but also what he wanted was to understand logic better. And he always made the claim that by finding these algorithmic computing dimensions of logic, he developed a deeper understanding of how those formalisms work. And I feel like if we were to come to technology with not low self-esteem or hubris, but with a kind of humble acknowledgement of what it's actually like to be a person, and how we know and how we settle disputes and how we disagree, and if we actually brought a kind of openness about our needs and the character of our knowing, we might design technology really differently. And we wouldn't celebrate these machines that are machines, that's not even the right word, these massive systems that are said to bypass us entirely, nor would we want simply to create a mirror for ourselves in them. But if we knew better, like what our actual needs were, like what is it that we want to know? What are the questions that actually drive us or motivate us, that machine learning would be very unsatisfying, and so too would heuristic AI, but that there might be a lot of space to think differently about how we are as knowers. And so I really love Wang's critique for that, but it's a bit of a stretch to apply it to the contemporary paradigm, I think. But it connects because it's all about us, of course, at the end of the day.
Thank you. Carla?
Yeah, thank you again for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. And I was thinking, because when you talked about the RAND Corporation, it made me think of the work of Jenny Anderson. And I wanted to ask you if you knew her work about futurology. And if
I
yes,
do not.
You do not?
No.
She has a book called The Future of the World. I can send the reference now.
Yes.
And so yeah, she talks about very similar topics, especially the image we have, like the conception of human intelligence, and of how futurologists wanted to change to manipulate human intelligence in a war context. So it's very related to your work, and I wanted to know if there was any collaboration between you two. And so now
No, Carla, the opposite. I don't know it, and it sounds like I should. Thank you very much.
She does not write in French. She writes in English, but she's based in France.
There's such a, I know that it's such a huge problem. The like the, especially in the US, the sort of, I mean, it is undoubtedly a hegemon, right? And being in the American Academy, there are such blinders about work that gets done elsewhere, and it's so frustrating. And so it's very bad that I don't know this book, but I don't know it. And
it is, but I had no idea your works were that related, actually, because I got to know Jenny Anderson since she works in France and in Sciences Po, but I didn't know it was that related. So I think it might be interesting to.
Of course, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
It looks like it will be related. There's a lot of literature that I also didn't understand how, because, I come from the history of math, and it's sort of been a really slow process of like trying to figure out that the history of math is this much broader thing than anybody realized. But there's a whole sort of recent surge in the history of the social sciences and the sort of decision-making sciences. And I love Jamie Cohen-Cole's work on the concept of the open mind that kind of ironically gets developed in the Cold War with the closed world as we need open minds in a closed world, and the tension between ways of thinking. And so I've seen literature about sort of the mind becoming like almost like a national resource for the United States. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm so into that. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, it's about the history of the conception of the future. So it's also about the mind. And since the mind is so interdisciplinaire,
that's wonderful.
I think both of your works will be very interesting to link together. So
thank you so much, Carla. And it's not too late. It's like I'm so worried that once my book goes in, then I can't engage with anybody else. But it's not too late, so I can read it and think about it before I submit the manuscript. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for your presentation. And we have another question, Raoul. Right?
Thank you for your presentation. Here, many times that I haven't speak English, I think that I will try to explain my pensée pour faire comme accent in English. My question is, what do you think about the incidence of ChatGPT on the future of literature?
Oh gosh, yeah. What are we going to do about ChatGPT? So I with all of our forays into new AI systems that we're afraid of, or whose implications are unclear, I tend on the side of skepticism over fear. Like ChatGPT is actually quite problematic. Like it can't solve basic word math problems, and there are a lot of things about it that I think can sort of reveal its limits, in the context of a classroom situation or a authorship set of authorship questions or something. But I actually just reviewed a book called Story Machines by Mike Sharples and Rafael Perez that was the whole history of AI or algorithmic storytelling machines. And it kind of ends, the book just came out like a few months before ChatGPT sort of started spreading, and they kind of ended with, looking forward, we're eventually going to have something like this, and what will the implications be? And it seems, for me, the thing I'm less concerned about what ChatGPT is going to do in the university. I am very concerned about the ways that it might be used to further entrench mis and disinformation campaigns and to create compelling false truths and claim that they came from a certain place or were written by a certain person when they weren't. But I think for me, again, it's always about us instead of being about the system in question. Like we have this whole reproducing phenomenon of the receding horizon, where we're always trying to hold something for ourselves that we claim the machine will never be able to do. So, for a long time, no one believed that the computer would ever be able to beat a grandmaster at chess. And then it does. And then we're left with this question, like, okay, now do we just throw out our belief that the human and machine are different in some way? Or do we just accept, oh, well, the computer beat a grandmaster at chess, that means it's as good as us, it's just like us. So what we're always doing is pushing the goalpost to the next thing that we can't imagine the computer doing. So after chess, then it was Go. And there's this New York Times article, this Princeton mathematician saying, well, I guess we thought it would never beat a grandmaster at chess, but it's done so, but it will never beat a grandmaster at Go. It's sort of moving the goalpost to identify something new that we think maybe computers will never be able to achieve. And then it does. And then we push the goalpost again, and we push it again. And we're sort of constantly trying to identify something to differentiate ourselves from the machine, but it's this cat and mouse game. And so I'm kind of interested in the existential dimension of ChatGPT, where people seem to be reckoning with the idea that maybe a computer has come along that can convincingly sort of produce text. And that looms large because of Turing's test in the history of AI. But I'm also interested in how many people are now saying, well, it will never be able to do this other thing. Like maybe it can do this, but it can't do that, and it can't do that, and it can't do that. And I think by sort of tracking how we sound out that moving goalpost, we get to learn a lot about ourselves and the sorts of things that we're afraid of, the sort of things that we have faith in, the sort of things that we want to characterize a human uniqueness. And my kind of stock answer about a lot of questions related to, what will the impact be when computers are capable of doing X, Y, or Z, is sort of to think that we never actually, I guess this sort of relates to that comment about hubris and low self-esteem again. It's like we never actually get replaced. People just get redefined, shuffled around. We have new jobs, we respond, we accommodate. And one of the things that, in a flipping the script kind of way, people are always talking about what the computer can and cannot do. I'm way more interested in what we can and cannot do with the computers. And, I'm going to redesign assignments in my class where students work with ChatGPT on purpose. And, I might deliver a whole lecture that ChatGPT wrote as like a teachable moment. Like, I think these tools are only as scary as we let them be. And they can be very scary because we're very quick to offload decision-making power and to subscribe to the stories about how powerful the systems are. But I don't know, I'm not optimistic about machine learning and AI at all, but I am trying really hard to be optimistic about people. And I think that if we allow ourselves space, that ChatGPT could become some kind of generative interlocutor rather than something else. But I don't know. I guess I don't know. But I think we can pay attention to a lot of this pushing of the goalpost around ChatGPT, and that we could also center it in conversations about what we want out of our world, you know, because I don't want to live in a world where my students produce papers that an AI wrote and I lecture according to what the AI says, and we're all just symbol manipulators who haven't understood anything. But I like to have the conversation of like, what is it that we're trying to understand? Or what is it that we want to know? Or how is it that we want to know? And then is there a place for this tool in that? And if there is, what is it? And if there isn't, then I don't need it. But I do think ChatGPT could potentially worsen our sort of mis and disinformation landscapes and continue to erode public trust in what they read and what they see. And I'm very concerned about those kinds of things for sure.
Thank you. It seems to me very sensible and reasonable. So thank you for this last word, because now it's past 7 p.m. in Paris, and we are going to end the seminar. Thank you again. I'm sure we will have more occasion maybe to invite you in Paris at some point in our project.
I do love Paris.
It's okay.
So please do.
Okay.
It was such a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day. For us, it's a night, but have a good day in Vancouver, and see you in the next episode of this seminar. Carla, you may announce the next meeting.
Yes, the next meeting will be on the 7th of March with Antonio Someini. So with a more artistic approach.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you
Goodbye.
again. Bye.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.